Urban legends are fun. There's nothing better than sitting around with some friends and telling scary stories. But what happens if these terrifying, graphic, and downright disgusting stories end up being real? Today, lady and man, welcome to Volume 2 of the most terrifying urban legends that turned out to be true. And buckle up, because today's ones are so much worse than Volume 1's, especially the last one. It'll probably need to be censored. Before we start, you know the rules. We're going in order of least spooky to most spooky. So if you're a wimp and you can't handle a little bit of spook, get off my channel. We don't allow wimps here. Imagine living in a small, peaceful town in Maine. It's the kind of place where nothing dramatic happens, where neighbors know each other and the natural beauty of the woods is just part of daily life. But over the years, a strange pattern began to emerge. People started noticing that small, seemingly insignificant items were going missing. It wasn't money, jewelry, or anything of obvious value. It was things like jars of peanut butter, boxes of crackers, batteries, or even propane tanks. At first, it was easy to brush off. Maybe you forgot where you put it. Maybe a neighbor borrowed it and didn't return it. But as time went on, more and more residents experienced these odd disappearances. This wasn't just a one-time thing. It happened again and again, over months, over years, for nearly 3 decades. Eventually, residents started to talk, sharing their experiences. Someone was sneaking onto their properties, stealing small supplies, and then disappearing into thin air. The mystery deepened when attempts to catch the culprit failed. Whoever was behind the thefts was extremely careful. They never left a trail, they never left behind evidence or clues. It was as if this person, if it even was a person, was a ghost. And this didn't just happen for a couple of weeks. This went on for 27 years. How the f did no one catch him in 27 years? In 2013, the truth finally came to light. The culprit wasn't a ghost or a mischievous prankster. It was Christopher Knight, a man who would later become known as the Maine Hermit. At just 20 years old, Knight walked into the woods near North Pond and never came back out. He had decided that this would be his new life. So for 27 years, Knight lived in total isolation, in a hidden campsite deep within the woods. No human contact, no phone, no electricity, no comforts of the modern life. He survived by stealing. What's even more remarkable is how he managed to evade detection for so long. Knight would study the habits of the residents, learning when they would be away from their homes. He avoided paths and trails, even practicing walking backwards to confuse anyone who might want to track him. And when he finally was caught, the community was shocked. People had spent decades wondering about the strange disappearances, and now they had their answer. Some were relieved to finally solve the mystery, but others were amazed by Knight's ability to survive in the wilderness for so long. If you used the internet in the late 90s and early 2000s, you'd recognize one of these emails. Chain emails were extremely common, but for a while a certain email made the rounds. It stated, "If a guy by the name of Slave Master contacts you, do not answer. He has killed 56 women that he has talked to on the internet. This is no joke. Send this to everyone you know." Well, it turns out Slave Master was a real person, who was in fact killing women that he met online. Slave Master's real name was John Edward Robinson. John Edward Robinson appeared to be an ordinary man, a husband, father, and a businessman. But John would eventually earn the title of the internet's first serial killer. Over 2 decades, Robinson used charm, deceit, and the privacy of the internet to lure vulnerable women to him, promising jobs, love, and security. Robinson's crimes began in the 1980s, when he lured women through fake job offers. By the 1990s, he shifted his tactics online, using aliases in chat rooms to manipulate victims. His method was methodical: isolate his victims, kill them, and conceal their bodies by dumping them in tanks and barrels full of chemicals on his property. In 2000, police uncovered his gruesome acts, linking him to at least 8 murders. He was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to death, and investigators believe more victims remain undiscovered. Staten Island, New York has a reputation for being a place of suburban comfort, but for decades, it was also home to one of the most chilling urban legends, Cropsey. If you grew up in the area, you probably heard the stories. Cropsey was said to be a monstrous figure, an escaped mental patient who lived in the tunnels beneath the abandoned Seaview Hospital. He was described as having a hook for a hand and a taste for terror, kidnapping victims who wandered too far from home. Parents used the legend to keep their kids in line. It was one of the stories that felt scary, but safe. A piece of folklore designed to scare kids into following the rules. But in the 1980s, the line between myth and reality blurred. Children on Staten Island started disappearing. First one, then another. 5 children in total went missing. As the investigation unfolded, one name kept coming up: Andre Rand. Rand was a former janitor at Willowbrook State School, an institution that had already been the subject of a scandal in the 1970s. Willowbrook had been exposed for horrifying conditions. Children were subjected to neglect, unsanitary environments, and even unethical medical experiments. It was a place straight out of a nightmare. Andre Rand had a history of criminal behavior and was known to frequent the abandoned hospital grounds. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered a chilling connection between Rand and the missing children. He was tied to their disappearances, and one of the victims, a young girl, was found buried in a shallow grave near the school. The legend of Cropsey suddenly felt all too real. Rand was eventually arrested and convicted of kidnapping. To this day, it is unclear how many victims Andre Rand had, as many of them still remain undiscovered. For years, urban legends circulated about an amusement park using real bodies as props. Most stories spoke about haunted houses with hidden backgrounds run by serial killers. And while the serial killer part of it is untrue, the rest of it is actually surprisingly real. In 1976, a film crew was shooting a scene at Pike Amusement Park in Long Beach, California. They were filming inside one of the park's spooky attractions when a crew member accidentally broke the arm off of what looked like a mannequin hanging in the corner. But to everyone's shock, the arm wasn't plastic or foam, it was bone. The mannequin was actually the mummified corpse of Elmer McCurdy, a train robber from the early 1900s. And McCurdy's story is kinda weird. After being killed in a shootout with police in 1911, his body went unclaimed. The local undertaker, seeing an opportunity, embalmed the corpse and began charging people a nickel to view it. And I'm not making this up. The visitors would have to drop the coins directly in McCurdy's mouth. Eventually, a man posing as a relative came to claim the body, but he wasn't looking to give McCurdy a proper burial. Instead, he turned the corpse into a traveling sideshow attraction. Over the years, McCurdy's body was passed from carnival to carnival, losing its identity as a human and eventually becoming another prop. By the time the film crew stumbled upon it, the story of Elmer McCurdy had been forgotten, and his body was assumed to be fake. After the discovery, McCurdy was finally laid to rest in Oklahoma, and his grave was covered in concrete to ensure no one would ever disturb him again. The idea of making something out of human skin seems like a gruesome horror movie trope. It's the kind of thing you'd see in a slasher film or read about in a chilling ghost story. But in the case of Big Nose George, it's actually a real story. George Parrott, known as Big Nose George, was an infamous outlaw in the American Wild West. He wasn't just a thief, he was ruthless. George and his gang terrorized the region by robbing trains, stealing horses, and murdering anyone who got in their way. But George's reign of terror didn't last forever. He was eventually caught and sentenced to his crimes. But it wasn't just the that made this story infamous. It was what happened after his death that set him apart. When no one came forward to claim George's body, 2 local doctors asked to take it in for medical research. At first, it seemed like they were going to study his brain to see if there was any physical traits that explained his criminal behavior. But their plans took a weird turn. The doctors skinned George's corpse, they tanned the skin, and they turned him into a pair of shoes. Imagine being some badass outlaw only to be turned into f***ing shoes. What a loser. It didn't stop there. Part of George's skull was cut off and given as a gift to a medical student, while the rest of his remains were stuffed into a whiskey barrel and buried. For years, the shoes were a curiosity, a morbid relic of the outlaw's legacy. Today, they're displayed at the Carbon County Museum in Rawlins, Wyoming. They're a chilling reminder of how f***ed up history can be. I mean, it's one thing to hear about crimes and executions, but the story of Big Nose George goes to a whole nother level of f***ed up. I think few things are as scary as the thought of being buried alive. It's absolute nightmare fuel, waking up in total darkness, surrounded by dirt and the crushing weight of a coffin lid. For most of us, it's just a nightmare, but for Octavia Hatcher, it was a reality. Octavia lived in Pikeville, Kentucky. She was a young woman married to a man named James Hatcher, but life took a turn when she fell gravely ill. At first, it seemed like a typical fever, but her condition quickly worsened. She became weak, unresponsive, and eventually slipped into a coma. In those days, medical science wasn't what it is today. Without modern equipment, doctors relied on basic science to declare someone dead. And so, when Octavia showed no signs of life, she was pronounced dead and buried soon after. But here's where things get f***ed up. Not long after Octavia was laid to rest, others in the town began falling ill with the same symptoms: fever, weakness, and eventually coma. But many of these people woke up after a few days, completely recovering from their illness. James Hatcher, Octavia's husband, was horrified. What if his wife hadn't been dead? Desperate for answers, he ordered her body to be dug back up. And when the coffin was opened, the scene inside confirmed his worst fears. Octavia's body was found in a state of panic. Her hands were bloodied, her fingernails broken and torn from clawing at the coffin lid. The lining of the coffin was shredded, evidence of her desperate struggle to escape. She had suffocated in the darkness, alive but trapped. Her body was reburied, but the story didn't end there. Octavia's tragic death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly mistakes could happen in a world without advanced medicine. Her grave became a local legend, and eventually a statue was erected in her memory. To this day, visitors to Pikeville tell stories about Octavia. Some claim to feel her presence near her grave. Others say the statue on her tomb seems to change its expression, as if it's mourning her fate. But one thing is for certain, the story of Octavia Hatcher is one of the most disturbing examples of why the fear of being buried alive resonates so deeply in all of us. Like, share, comment, subscribe.